Okay, just a little bit of review from last time. We're at the point where the Taliban takes over Kabul, and we're 1996, and they capture Najibullah, the Soviet, what they call puppet, and they kill him. Let's look at what else they're facing. They're facing some ethnic opposition. From who? Uzbeks. And we're familiar with the word Dostum, but the warlord of the Uzbeks is from up in this part of Afghanistan, and he takes refuge in Uzbekistan, and they sponsor him actually. We have the Hazara, which we know from the Kite Runner and the story. They're descendants of the Mongols that are still there from the Mongol Empire hundreds of years ago. And then we've heard about the Tajiks over and over again, and we'll be talking more about them today. And the effective military control at that time was Uzbeks Hazara. They had an alliance, and they controlled this part of Afghanistan, and they'd been fighting with the Taliban up here for years. And there'd been atrocity after atrocity on both sides. And the Tajiks controlled this part of Afghanistan that borders on Tajikistan. This is the Pamir Valley that we've talked about before, and we'll be talking about again, because it is Masoud's territory. I've mentioned Masoud, but this is the episode where he's one of the main characters. And he and Dostum will form a northern alliance, which will become very effective after 9/11. But we're not quite ready for that yet. And so the Taliban, they take control in Kabul, and they're on a roll, and they go up to Mazar-e-Sharif, the Uzbek territory, and get their revenge. And they kill thousands of people, including 9 Iranian diplomats who were up there. They captured the Hazara leader. We talked about that last time, and they threw him out of a helicopter and blew up his statue. Masoud survives, and he's a very charismatic, canny leader, as you'll see. And as he retreats up to where he was born in the Panjshir Valley, he blows up a tunnel on the Salang Pass in Afghanistan, of a crucial area in Afghanistan that we had to master. So the Salang Pass, and there's a tunnel. It's almost 13,000 feet. At the time it was built, it was the highest tunnel in the world, and continued to be for at least another decade. And this is why they needed a tunnel up there. And even with a tunnel, this was not passable during winter in a snowstorm, particularly in snow. Maybe they could get it open if there's no snow for a couple of weeks, but it's crucial, and it's why the Tajiks had been able to hang on so long up there with their independence. And it's part of a ring road that goes, we've showed you on the map, the ring road that goes right around the center of Afghanistan. It was, interestingly, it was built by the Soviets for the monarchy when they were still ruling. And it was repaired by the Soviets in 2000, and by Russia, I should say, in 2002. They have an attachment to this tunnel. So even after the Soviet Union fell, they helped repair it after Masoud blew it up. And so Masoud was able to have some independence, particularly in the wintertime. It's a crucial military strategic possession. Now, in 2001, Masoud's still hanging on up in the Tajik Valley, even though the Taliban have been in control for 5 years. And he goes to the EU, to their assembly, and he makes a plea. And he says, you don't know how bad the Taliban is. They're religious extremists. Pakistan is fiddling with Afghanistan, and we're all suffering, and you all need to do something about the Taliban. This is in 2001. And who's he with? Dr. Abdullah Abdullah. Now, I don't know how much you followed the politics of Afghanistan since 2001, but he pops up over and over again. And I want to take a minute to talk about him. And of course, I'll come back and correct the spelling. I did this pretty quick. This is him in 2004. He's a survivor. And there's something that he has survived in 2004, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But more about Abdullah Abdullah. By the way, his given name is just Abdullah. He's one of these people in the world that decide to just take one name. And it was driving the Western press crazy. And they say, you've got to have 2 names so we can keep you straight. And he said, okay, I'm Abdullah Abdullah. His father was Pashtun, his mother's Tajik. So ethnically, he's mixed. He's in an ideal position to bring 2 of the major ethnic groups in Afghanistan together and maybe create a nation. And we've seen this before, even back in the Durrani Empire. There was a lot of infighting with the among the Pashtun tribal leaders, and the reigning emperor at the time said, "Okay, you guys, you're making a coalition against me. I'm going in a coalition with the Tajiks." And to do that, he agreed to move the capital from Kandahar to Kabul, the first time that the Pashtuns had ruled from Kabul. And that was an alliance with the Tajik. So there's some historic precedent for an alliance between Pashtuns and Tajik. And this guy's staying power, because you're going to see him over and or you have seen him over and over again, popping up in as part of almost every government since 2001. He was a doctor. He was trained in medical school in Kabul. He was further trained in Kabul as an ophthalmologist. All right. He had spent a third of his childhood in Kabul, a third of his childhood in Kandahar, and a third of his childhood in the Pamir Valley, where his mother was from, along with Masoud. And he became a good buddy of Masoud. After he was trained as an ophthalmologist, he decided, I need a little bit more training. I'm going to Pakistan for a year. This is 1983. But the Soviets have invaded, and he's in Pakistan just a year and says, I got to go back and fight the Soviets. And where does he go? He goes to the Pamir Valley and partners up with Masoud. And so that's why he's sitting by Masoud's side in Brussels, giving their pitch to the EU to do something about the Taliban. I'm going to be talking more about him later and what happened and what he had to survive to get to 2004. But I want to go back and sequence as much as possible. But when I introduce a new character, I want to tell you he's important and why he's important. So back to Afghanistan. What kind of regime are they going to, after they've subdued the Uzbeks and they've subdued the Hazara, and the Tajiks are still holding out north of the blown up tunnel? How are they going to rule? And they make it clear they're copying Saudi Arabia, the Wahhabis. And so they have their own Department of Promotion of Virtue and Prevention of Vice. And this is where we stopped last time. They have street police, brutal. So the question was, hey, maybe the Taliban will mellow. And my guru, Sadiq, says, no, they are loyal to their base. And who are their base? It's the rural south, the Pashtun homeland. And the folks there have been suffering during the civil war that has been going on for 15 years. And they come in and they take power. We showed how they did that last time under Omar. And they impose a harsh order, which is welcomed in the rural area. They're tired of warlords coming through. And so they have real rural legitimacy. The local clerical networks, they have been working with the Taliban and start working with them more during the occupation. There's an incentive. We got to, and then the civil war, we've got to get peace. And so they influence the clans, which are often nothing more than local Pashtun warlords. But they penetrate the clan authority structure and kind of take over the Pashtun legitimacy. Yet they're Pashtun enough to still follow Pashtun Wali, and there's something called Andi Wali, which means camaraderie. So they're still Pashtun. So they're kind of between the harsh Saudi style and their traditional ethnic customs. And again, it's the geography that dictates a lot of this stuff. There's so many valleys. And this is why it's hard to rule. It's hard to get to these villages. And you can imagine these villages isolated, not just from the world, but from each other, are suspicious of outsiders. And zealots can, the local clerical Pashtun clerics can keep them under control because of their suspicion of others, and they hear about the Taliban taking revenge on the elites, the former Pashtun elites that were royalists and even communists. And so it's that rural base that the Taliban rely on. But then the militants decide that they're going to do Sharia and abandon the Pashtun legal code, such as it is. And so they adopt something called hudud, which is what the Wahhabis introduced or reintroduced to Saudi Arabia. Amputations of limbs for theft, stoning for adultery, lashes for alcohol consumption. Now, adultery, you'll see, has other options. Here, a woman is getting 100 lashes for being accused of being an adulteress. And this is one of the local clerics who have been won over to hudud and Sharia and have abandoned the Pashtun code. And here's some disturbing scene from an outtake from a film showing the stoning of an adulteress in a small village in one of these valleys. So they take it to the extreme. So over time, over a couple of years, a lot of Pashtuns come to detest what the Taliban has done. And it's not just that they've gone along with the Saudis, it's also that they've ignored material improvements. That's not their priority. And remember that a lot of Pashtun mujahideen, or even before the Taliban came onto the scene, had fought with Masoud. Masoud was very charismatic. And so they said, yeah, we're Pashtuns, but this guy, Masoud, he's leading the only effective resistance to the Soviets. So they had fought under Masoud, quite a few. Now, it's true that the Taliban stayed loyal to the Pashtuns in the sense of supporting the language, but they had to. It didn't mean much because a lot of the clerics in these villages were illiterate. And so that didn't signify much. The other thing that bothered them, in addition to the adaptation of Sharia to the villages, was the Arabs and the Pakistanis seemed to be getting a favoritism. So the members of the Taliban that were Arab and that were Pakistanis. And then the Taliban overplayed their hand. They banned the national flag. They banned the national anthem. And all of the national history and tradition went up in smoke. They were now more under the influence of the Saudis, more globally oriented. And this was in a country that had never been colonized, had never been ruled by another European country. Sure, the Tajiks had come in with Babur as he was setting up the Mughals. But even the Mughals, after Babur went down to Delhi, never ruled over Afghanistan. And so here they were, and Saudi money is all over the place. And hey, they're just buying their privilege, and they're trying to use this. And the Saudis are here, and they're a magnet for all these Islamic terrorists from around the world. And bin Laden, he didn't start this process. It was already going on, but he inherited it. And as a charismatic leader himself, he boosted it and turbocharged. So before you knew it, they were aping what the Wahhabis had done in the 1700s in Mecca, and destroyed the idols. And you'll remember the Wahhabis even threatened to blow up Muhammad's tomb in Medina. And so they destroyed the Buddhist statues that had been there for a millennium. And I think I remember experiencing that very emotionally, because they did it thoroughly. Nothing was left of the Bamiyan Buddhas. So there's a tension, because even the Taliban purported to be Deobandis. And we've talked about that before, the difference between Hanafi and Hanafi. And they were more considered to be more tolerant than what was happening throughout Afghanistan. And just remember, the Hanafis followed an imam from the 8th century, very early in the 1st century, and he was Persian, which is interesting because the Persians are very close to the Afghanis ethnically, and much different than the Arabs and the Semites. So the Deobandis believe in guidance by an imam, and somebody like Omar that rises up and commands support, where the Wahhabi Afghani Arabs didn't believe that there was any imam that had to be followed. But in practice, bin Laden was treated like an imam, and he was followed. I think I've showed this before. I just want to emphasize that even today, the Deobandis in India, we know Deoband, the city, is in India, and they've urged the Taliban to be pragmatic. Now, given all this conflict and tension, there was an unexpected compromise, a hybrid that emerged called Pashtun Islamists, which wasn't quite Wahhabist, but it certainly wasn't Pashtun nationalism. And the main difference they were breaking with the Saudis over was this focus on global growth and global governance. They were still Pashtun enough to re-embrace the concept of Pashtunistan. Now I'm talking in big generalities, but we're getting to the end, and I've got to come up with some final summations and at least a way for some footholds to see the importance of the history of the Pashtuns. So what was the effect of this kind of compromise that evolved over a few years within Afghanistan? What was the effect on Pakistan? So Pakistan had invested in the Afghani Taliban in hopes that they would attract any energy that was headed towards Pashtunistan, that it would be shunted into some sort of global movement and not something that would be directed against Pakistan. And so the conflict in Pakistan, then there was a party, an Islamist party, the JUI, and they were fighting with the pure nationalists, just like the Pakistan army hoped they would. And the ethno-nationalists, the more secular, just called out, hey, we're being manipulated by the Pakistani military. And they're using and trying to use the Taliban as a demolition squad for our goal of a Pashtunistan. So you had in the Pashtun Islamist in Pakistan very slowly are evolving to support their own version of the Taliban in Pakistan. So far, the Taliban is mainly important only in Afghanistan. But they occasionally cooperated with the government, who was trying to seek favor with the Pashtun nationalist sensibilities. Remember, they renamed the Northwest province of the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and they decided to also try to accommodate the Hazara and carve out an area for them that they would call the land of the Hazara. And the Pashtun Islamists on this particular issue were flexible. And this drove the Pashtun nationalists, the secular nationalists, crazy. And this is the Pashtun Islamists who did a deal over the Hazara. And so you can see the tone of this is a tension between the Pashtun Islamist and the Pashtun secular nationalists. But the Taliban in Afghanistan maintained some independent links. They weren't purely the puppets of the military. And they even established some connections with the sectarian nationalists, extremists. And so it wasn't all rigid. And there was even some flirtation with Texans. What? Texans. In 1997, a delegation of Taliban officials visited Texas. And for them, they were interested, both parties, in a pipeline from Turkmenistan to Pakistan. And so they were continuing to talk. And I just mentioned these examples to show that there was some flexibility there. And this flexibility is going to come up later in the context of what America decided to do. So here they are in 1997 in Texas, in front of the Christmas tree. Go figure. So Pakistan, though, was paying the bills. They were paying the salaries, keeping the telephone lines in Kabul and Kandahar open. They were still training the madrassas, ensuring new blood within the Taliban. And we saw that the Pakistani intelligence had begun their manipulation of the Afghani religionists under 1977 under Bhutto. And that certainly continued, and they put money into it. And this sort of bribed the Afghani Taliban. And why did they do that? They needed every ally they could get. They wanted to keep Afghanistan weak, so India couldn't go in and exploit Afghanistan, and then they'd be facing a two-front war. They were still all had suspicion against the Russians, and the Russians came in and built that Salang tunnel, and that got them a little bit paranoid. And Iran, always on the sideline. So they asked in return, hey, let's finally deal with this Durand line. Will you, as the government of Afghanistan, finally accept your eastern border with us? And they said, the Taliban said, nah, we're not going that far. And so the Pakistanis didn't understand that there was still this glimmer of hope for a Pashtunistan. And just to remind you what the vision of a Pashtunistan would be, this is the big block that's mostly in Afghanistan, and it comprises 50% of the population, but it flows over into Pakistan and accounts for around 20% of their population. So Pakistan has always considered this threat since 1977. And Bhutto. It wasn't just the military. Then this compromise I talked about earlier, Pashtun Islamism, kind of took Pakistan by surprise. What? You're Taliban? You're still Pashtun? And yes, they were. And the Pashtuns in Pakistan started expressing their anger with the Pakistani government and the persecution of some Pashtuns. And so you have this huge contradiction where Pakistan is backing Taliban extremists in Afghanistan, but the Taliban extremists develop power in Pakistan itself. So real blowback. And the Taliban reaches deep into Pakistan society because there are Pashtuns embedded throughout Pakistan society. But on the border, the Pashtuns started copying in Pakistan what their Taliban brothers in Afghanistan were doing. The other thing with the Taliban, with the Pashtun religious extremists, is they're very violent and anti-Shia, and so they start blowing up Shia mosques in particular, but they also assassinate politicians from the Sindh and the Punjab who seem to be taking a stand against Islamism. And so even then, globalism hangs around, and some of the Taliban in Pakistan go farther than their Afghan brothers and dream of a union between Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Central Asia. So even larger than Pashtunistan. So I'm just trying to give you a taste for what the far ends of the spectrum were. None of this is totally coherent. And when I show you the map of all the different influences in going on in Afghanistan, you can understand that it's not totally coherent. And so the Durand line again, and this is interesting, I found 80% of the military rank and file are come from the Punjab and are totally unfamiliar with Pashtun sensibilities. And you'd think because 20% of the military is Pashtun, they would be, but there's an insensitivity there. And they continue to push Mullah Omar to recognize the Durand line, and he pushes back a bit against his benefactors who are paying for whatever civic services that his government can render to the populace. He says, no, Pakistan, why don't you get an Islamic government? Just like our Taliban here. So he throws down the gauntlet and exerts his independence, as we've seen over and over again in this theater in history, ethnic independence. All right, so that's the background. Now throw in the wild card. Here's the wild card. And Aiko, I need you to tell me when it's 5 till.
Okay.
During most of the Soviet invasion and then the Civil War that followed, and when the Soviets left, bin Laden and his fellow Arabs had been hanging out in Peshawar. And we've talked about that historic city, but it's become a Pashtun town, mainly because of all the refugees fleeing the Civil War. Finally, he decides to go the other way and get a foothold in Afghanistan itself. And you remember his father was a big-time civil engineer. His father redid Mecca, as we talked about in an earlier episode. So he is known in the Muslim world as being from an important family. And so he goes over into the Coast province in Afghanistan, into the caves of Tora Bora. And now that the Taliban have a foothold and are at least in control of the bottom 2/3 of Afghanistan, he feels secure. And he's over there and doing his engineer stuff. And the Taliban, they say, he's recommending some pretty radical things. They offer to hand him over to the Saudis. And this was after a bombing in Riyadh, or the after effects of that, put pressure on the Taliban. But the Saudis didn't want him. Bin Laden, being charismatic himself, starts whispering in the ear of key Taliban leaders, and even Omar himself. And then he teams up with Zawahiri, who is much more radical. than bin Laden is at this time. And bin Laden becomes even more radical. And the two of them attract waves of Islamists that realizing that the Mujahideen have thrown out and destroyed the Soviet empire. They look locally and they say, hey, we'd like some of that. And they come to Afghanistan to join with other Islamists. And bin Laden keeps making pronouncements and causing trouble while he's living in Afghanistan, and he doesn't stay in contact with Taliban leaders. But they both, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda now, as it's known, have a common enemy, and that's Masoud, because he's still holding out in the north, and he doesn't like the Arabs very much. So here they are in Tora Bora inside the caves, and we've talked before about the tension that there is with Afghan culture, with Pashtun culture, and they add even a bigger suggestion to the Pashtuns that they're being used. They even use the term Afghanistan is a stepping stone to the world. Who wants to be a stepping stone? None of the leaders in Al-Qaeda were Pashtuns, none of them. And Al-Qaeda never cared about bringing peace to Afghanistan or easing the miseries of Pashtuns themselves. And so under the influence of Zawahiri, bin Laden gets more audacious, and in 1996 warns the British to get out of the Gulf. The Taliban said, okay, that's enough. Bin Laden, why don't you move to Kandahar? They never say we've captured bin Laden. They say he fell into our hands. And so he falls into their hands, and it's really a form of house arrest. And they suggest very gently, you've got to move to Kandahar so they can keep an eye on bin Laden. So, okay, he goes, but he's not a really good guest, and he doesn't always do what he's told. So in 1998, he and Zawahiri get together again back near Tora Bora, and he issues the fatwa against Americans. Not just against our soldiers, but against you and me too, American civilians, wherever they are. It's an individual duty. And every Muslim who can do it in any country should do it. And we've got to do this to liberate the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. And we've got to do this to get the troops out of Saudi Arabia. And neither of these things are high on the Taliban things to do list. And so, nevertheless, bin Laden's charisma saves him again. And he finally gets the ear of Omar living in Kandahar, and he talks about the grand construction projects that he can do, like his father in Afghanistan. And then he says, besides, I pledge loyalty to you, Mullah Omar, and I won't make any more public statements. I won't, no more fatwas. What's America doing at this time in 1998? they had the Soviet Union had fallen, and they just walked away from Afghanistan. And they kept arm's length, didn't really get involved until bin Laden and Al-Qaeda bombed the US embassies in Africa in 1998. Now we're engaged, and we take it to Security Council, and they say, Taliban, hand over bin Laden for what he's doing. And he said, nobody sells weapons to Taliban anymore. This is the UN. They even address Pakistan's mucking around there, calling on all foreign governments to withdraw the support of the Taliban in Afghanistan, and they banned all flights. So this is 1998. At that point, the Saudi intelligence say, turn over our citizen bin Laden. Well, now it's been a couple of years since they last offered to turn him over, but now.
6 minutes till.
Okay.
6 minutes till.
Okay, thank you. Now the Taliban leaders refuse under pressure to turn him over. But their foreign minister says, how about a trial? We could come up with some trial of him for what he has done. And that was rejected by America because they just wanted to have bin Laden themselves and for a trial in America. They weren't going to let the Taliban try him. And he even suggested an Islamic court of 3 Muslim countries could be formed to hear the case against bin Laden. This was the Organization of Islamic Countries. And nope, America said, we want them for ourselves. And it was difficult because America didn't recognize the Taliban. There were only 3 countries that even recognized the Taliban. So it was hard, and nothing happened, and it just lingered on. Bin Laden stayed in Afghanistan, and the Taliban could never prosecute him because he hadn't violated any of their laws. But they realized he was a bad guest. And Omar was reportedly said to have said somewhere before 2001 in early 2000, we got to get rid of this guy, but they didn't know how. And if America had known this and had an intelligence that outlined the tensions between the Saudis and the Afghani Taliban, maybe we could have been had another alternative. And we didn't recognize that the Saudis and the Taliban were from different backgrounds. The Arabs were wealthy, the Taliban were poor. The Arabs seemed to be focused on the globe, or at least the revolution in their own home countries, and weren't doing anything for Afghanistan. And they realized at some point that they were pawns in a game. But Pashtunwali was still there, and it's impossible to force a bad guest out. So I think this is probably a good place to stop, so we can I can at least entertain some questions, because we have a pretty hard deadline. When I come back next week, for the final lecture on the Pashtuns. I promise it's got to be next week as we go on to the Silk Road. After that, I'll talk a little bit about the new great game that's afoot after 9/11. But I'll stop here and take questions.
Okay, I have a couple questions going way back in your lecture. If the Pashtuns had all that support from the rural areas, they don't have any money, they're not educated. So the Pashtuns have rural support. Is that's, I'm assuming that's where they're getting their warriors from, the people who are going to battle, you know. So I'm just trying to figure out if the Pashtuns have rural support, but not support in the more educated areas, who's funding their, their weapons and
the Saudis. So I'd say the Saudis, and they're paying for the education of village kids in the madrassas. That's who's in the madrassas, these rural village kids. And the Saudis are taking the oil money that they made from supplying us with petrochemicals, and using part of it, they're playing a total double game and aiding the subsidizing the poor rural areas in Afghanistan, and that keeps when you graduate from a madrasa, what do? You go and you join the Taliban and learn how to use a weapon.
And is that part of the Saudi kind of sort of buying off of the militants? Is that they're supporting the religious the madrasas, and so those religious leaders are supporting are just sort of letting the Saudis do what they want to with rule?
Yeah, and remember, as we've said, the Pakistanis are in on this too. They also subsidize the madrasas, and
plus they have plenty of right-wing madrasas in Pakistan.
Right, and they're probably also the ISI, the army thing in Pakistan. There's a lot of covert money flowing to the Taliban. Yeah.
I thought that Afghanistan didn't have much oil. And if they have oil, which part of Afghanistan?
No, they don't have oil. I didn't. The Saudi.
No, he was referring to the Saudis.
The Saudi have tons of money from oil.
Yeah, but you talked about the Pashtuns that went to Texas, right?
Well, they wanted a pipeline.
They
didn't have the source.
Yeah, there was a Texas entrepreneurs that were that knew about oil and pipelines that wanted to do a deal, and if they could get the Taliban to agree, they'd be richer. So it was more Afghanistan as a corridor for oil.
I sadly have to leave. This has been, my question was, John, can you make this really, really simple for me, please? And on that note, I will leave you. That was way too complicated.
Okay, well, next week is the grand summary.
Thank you, John. This is Barb. I'm also leaving.
Okay, bye.
Next
Bye,
week.
everybody.
Thank you. That was
Thank you.
fascinating.
Really, I'm so excited about next week.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Bye.